Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another brief social studies presentation. Before we get started, I just want to remind us of a few good note-taking tips. Remember, you want to take notes on only the most important information, and you want to be listening to what I'm saying in addition to looking at the slides. If you ever need to stop the video or rewind it at all, feel free to do that and go back and get the answers. So let's get started. We're talking about the Southern Campaign today, the last part of the American Revolution, and we're talking about 1780 to 1781. We know that by the time 1780 rolls around, the British are running into quite a few problems. First, we know that the Battle of Saratoga let France enter the war on the side of America, and France's entry into the war really makes the revolution a global war, sort of like the 7 Years' War from earlier that we learned about. Not only does England have to fight America, but they have to fight France, Spain, and the Netherlands as well. The Dutch also joined the war. So now England's fighting a war not just against its pesky colonies, but also against the rest of the world, it would seem. And they can't really fully commit their troops to the American problem anymore, the American front. They're forced to fight all these other countries, and as a result, they can't commit their troops to just fighting in their colonies or their former colony at this point. So the British decide to take the battle south. England decides that they should really start relying on loyalists, people who are loyal to the crown, and African slaves to help them fight. And both of these groups were really prevalent in the southern states of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. But the British sort of overestimate how many people how these people are going to help them out. For instance, a lot of loyalists don't want to join the British because they're afraid of what the Patriots are going to do to them. They don't want any backlash from their neighbors who might support the Patriots or might support the American cause for independence. Similarly, a lot of African slaves, they do decide to fight, but many of them are afraid to do so because their owners may be patriots and they don't want to anger them, because we know that the slave codes at this time were very harsh towards slaves who disobeyed their masters. Up until this point, a lot of the Southerners felt like this was more of a northern war. It was a war between maybe the New England colonies and Great Britain. But as the war goes south, it really becomes a true America problem, not just the New England and Middle states, but the southern states are now involved. After the Battle of Saratoga, General Howe loses his job, and he's replaced by someone named Henry Clinton, who's on this slide here on the right side. He moves his base of operations from Philadelphia back to New York City, and he comes up with a plan to try and take the southern states. He sails his forces of about 14,000 men from North Carolina to Charleston, South Carolina. And one of the reasons why he attacks Charleston is because it's a major port city, sort of like New York, but in the South. Charleston has many ships coming in and out of it, and if you can control Charleston, you can really control a major hub of transportation and really the economy in the southern states. So Henry Clinton sets his sights on Charleston to attack, and he sends Charles Cornwallis in command of those troops. He lets Cornwallis take over, and he's really the man who's going to be moving the troops throughout the southern states. The British are really successful at the start of their southern campaign, mostly because they're better equipped than the Americans, and they were fairly easily able to take over South Carolina in 1780. The British expected a lot of loyalists to join their side, but they didn't have the numbers that they expected to come out and help them. So while they go south in hopes that the loyalists will join them, it doesn't happen in the numbers that they wanted. Another thing that the British have constantly struggled with at this point in time is fighting guerrilla-style warfare, and that doesn't mean the apes. That obviously means using your environment against your enemy, whether it be hit-and-run attacks, camouflage, just not marching in ranks. The British aren't able to counter these attacks by the Americans, and the U.S. begins to chip away at the British using this guerrilla-style warfare. This is thanks in part to General Nathaniel Greene, who replaced Horatio Gates. So Nathaniel Greene, he replaces Gates, and he's now basically second in command to George Washington. And you could see an image of Greene here, who really leads those Southern campaigns against the British. So Cornwallis, he decides that after he wins in South Carolina and Georgia, he thinks that the southern states are secure. He starts to move his armies northward into North Carolina. Part of his issue is that he doesn't think the war could end until Washington surrenders. His thinking of this is that Washington is the leader of the entire Continental Army, and he thinks unless Washington's captured, the American movement is still going to take hold, and Americans are still going to fight against the British. So Cornwallis really sets his sights on capturing Washington. This is what he really wants to do. And of course, Washington's in the north, so he starts marching his troops north from South Carolina into North Carolina and later on Virginia. The goal is really to catch Washington between Cornwallis's troops from the south and Henry Clinton's troops from the north. As you can see on the screen here, that red line represents where Cornwallis is going to go, and in hopes of Clinton moving south, they're going to sort of sandwich him there in between Virginia. And that is Cornwallis's hope that the war would end with Washington being caught. So Cornwallis moves north into North Carolina and later on into Virginia to do this. And this leads us to the final major battle of the American Revolution, a battle called Yorktown. Again, Henry Clinton, he instructs Cornwallis to move north for Yorktown and wait for the Navy from New York to get there. This way they have a massive fighting force to capture Washington finally. Unfortunately for the British, this proves to be a terrible decision. It does not work out well, partially because Yorktown forms a peninsula. For those of us who need a little brush up on our geographic terms, a peninsula is an area with water on three sides, and you can sort of see that highlighted here on the map. While Cornwallis comes from the south, Washington and his troops come from the north, and the hope is that the British troops, the Navy, come from the Atlantic to sort of corner Washington. However, Washington has sprung a trap. The American and French armies are going to converge onto Yorktown. They're going to go closer to Yorktown, and the French are going to blockade this peninsula, meaning that they're going to take their ships and they're going to block any British ships from coming in to help out Cornwallis. As a result, Cornwallis and the city are put under siege, meaning they are attacked. You could sort of see that here. If you look in the center of this image, you could see Cornwallis's troops. They're sort of trapped between the York River and the land that is surrounded by Washington's troops and the American troops in general. Those little blue boxes have surrounded the little red boxes. The British Navy can't come in to help him, Cornwallis, because the French are busy blockading this area. So as a result, Cornwallis is forced to surrender, and it really ends the fighting in the Revolution in 1781. Cornwallis has nowhere to go, he's forced to surrender, and America wins the Battle of Yorktown, thanks in part to the French Army and Navy to help blockade and prevent the British from coming in. So how did the U.S. even win this? They were going up against a major fighting force, but there's a couple reasons. First, guerrilla warfare. The British never were able to adapt to it. And also the fact that the British had to fight a war 3,000 miles away from home. While the Americans had home field advantage, the British were busy sending supplies across the Atlantic Ocean and sending word back across the Atlantic to Britain again. It was a long, slow process for the British. It also didn't help that the British generals, especially Howe, made a lot of tactical mistakes early in the war. I'm thinking instead of Saratoga, he went to Philadelphia. That is a major mess up. So he and his mistakes really allowed America to survive. Also, the fact that Washington wasn't caught during his retreat was a huge problem as well for the British. It also helps a lot that the French joined in after the Battle of Saratoga. With the French help, the United States was much more easily able to adapt to the war and really help them win. Washington, while he wasn't the greatest strategist, his use of spies was incredibly important to help him win the war too. And it also helped that as the war went on, England's population really didn't support the war as much as they did early on. It was a really expensive war, and as a result, the British people didn't like the fact that it cost so much and it was taking so long. So how did the war end? Well, with a treaty, of course, and in this case, it's the Treaty of Paris of 1783. I know it's